All right, welcome. Welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. We took a little break there from the podcasts for no real reason. If this was a Hollywood podcast, if this was Mark Maron, there'd be a very interesting existential reason. There isn't. And we kind of took a pause, looked around, and I've realized a lot of you guys are listening, and I appreciate it. 25 episodes, and you're still with me. Thank you very much. This is the 25th Epi-versary. I'm just as clever as the day is long. Jim Egbert, who is one of our previous and popular podcast guests, comes back, and we review the first 25 episodes, and we covered a lot in those first 25 episodes, I realized looking back. We have a whole bunch of new episodes. This is a new episode. The next episodes, they're all new episodes. We have a whole bunch of not looking back, looking forward episodes coming up. Peter Shanley, Neil Cohen. It's going to be great. But this is part one of two. Jim Egbert back to talk about the first 25 episodes of Something Ventured. Thank you guys so much for listening. All right, welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest today, Jim Egbert, back again. How are you doing?
Good.
It's great to have you
here.
Glad
to be here.
This is the 25th episode. 25th anniversary episode. I misspoke that to somebody the other day. They're like, have you been doing it for 25 years? I was like, no, there wasn't podcasting 25. I didn't start in the in this podcast, Something Ventured. We explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as we sit down with the people who are shaping the way we view the world online and beyond. And so today we're gonna have a little fun. We're gonna kind of recap the first 25 episodes. We've covered a lot of turf. Jim is an executive at a massive financial institution tasked with keeping an eye on Silicon Valley for them, has worked at startups, has worked at huge companies, and had one of our more popular podcasts in which we talked about software...
Globalization, the globalization of engineering and the democratization, I think, of engineering talent and what's going to be in the future.
And talent moving around the world.
Yeah.
But today we thought we would take a look back at the first 25 episodes.
So is this then the official silver edition, right?
I guess this
I think this is the silver edition, right?
Yeah, this is the one where we say, do we keep going? Do we keep doing these or not? Like, we can bang through and see what we've learned. I've actually learned a lot doing these podcasts.
Yeah, so I took some time to listen to the podcasts, and it's very interesting. Yeah. I think as we talk about these, everybody will get a real sense of the evolution.
Yeah,
but it is very interesting to see how it's evolved.
Yeah, it's. In fact, I'm off to, I was just mentioning, off to Mexico City next week. And it was somebody heard the podcast. And, they don't know that hundreds, not millions of people listen to this. So if you're listening to it in the future, it may be millions of people. And they were like, hey, do you want to come down and talk? And we've been talking on this podcast about entrepreneurship in Mexico.
Right.
And around the world. Similar to what we were talking about. Not everybody could move to Silicon Valley. And there's plenty of money in Mexico City. And he said, hey, do you want to come down? So...
That's fantastic.
It's the first, the millions of dollars haven't poured in yet, but a trip to Mexico City doesn't, hurt.
So it's a good thing I got a Sharpie in my hand. I can get an autograph before I leave.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Good news.
And podcasting itself has become a huge thing. I mean, it was, but there in the last couple of weeks been about 5 or 6 articles about how podcasting has emerged and become a huge sort of thing.
It's very interesting you say that. I recently met somebody about a month ago, and we were just sort of talking about how we spend some of our free time when you're doing things that you do during the course of a normal day, where you get in your car and you maybe go to work, or some people get on a bus, or they get on mass transportation like a subway, what have you, and they go off to work or on their way home or they're on their way to school. And it's interesting because you used to listen to the radio.
Yep.
And this individual was saying, most of my friends and myself are listening to podcasts.
Right.
They're, it's not even iTunes now. It's like we're really listening to podcasts about things. That's how they're getting, and interestingly, that's how they're getting their information. There's a little snippets of, I want a little bit of the daily news.
Yep.
I can get that in 30 digestible minutes.
Yeah.
And then I want to spend the rest of my time learning stuff along the way.
It's lovely. And the sort of the quality of the stuff you can get. I mean, the NPR stuff, This American Life, music, whatever the heck you're into. It's kind of incredible.
Well, you mentioned one quite often on a lot of your podcasts that you listen to.
Yeah, the Mark Maron podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And this individual brought that up and said, that's a great podcast. Listen to that frequently.
Yeah. There's a new one. The new #1 podcast is called Serial. Have you heard of this?
No.
So it came out of This American Life, and what they're doing. So This American Life tells one story, and they go on for like an hour. This one is they're telling one story over like months, like every week. It's a serial, like the old serial radio. And the story is they go back and they find this guy who was convicted of killing his girlfriend when he was a teenager. And as they go back and look at the court case and all that, it's not clear whether or not this guy has done it or not. And she interviews people and the kids, and it's just fascinating. And it's the number one podcast on iTunes now.
Interesting.
So they
right?
they certainly figured something out.
Yeah, I mean, changing the way that you learn and get information for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So I began with. Should we start at the beginning?
We should. I think we should. I think
this
we
will
should
be the
try
canonical. If you haven't listened to the first 25 episodes, you listen to this one. I'll fill you in.
Yeah, you'll be good, right? I think this will be
a little bit of what we learned along the way. So it started. So we begin. You've listened to that more recently than I have. What did I set out to do? The first one was called Why.
The first one was called Why, and I made some notes, so everybody should keep this in mind if you're listening to this as we go through and knock out each of the remaining 24 of these. Yeah. There were 3 goals of this particular podcast, and we'll revisit this at the end, I'm assuming, when we decide whether you should be going forward or not.
Yep.
The first one is let's take a look at what goes on in Silicon Valley.
Yep.
And then the second was let's get to know people. Let's get to know, and you didn't say specifically in Silicon Valley, which was interesting. You said, let's just get to know people. Yeah. And I think that's happened. And then let's learn.
Yeah.
So the notes I made are, who did we meet and what did we learn? Mm-hmm. And did we learn some interesting stuff about the Valley?
Yeah.
So I think, sort of that would be a good framework for the conversations as we get through the next 24.
Yeah. So the second episode, Crystal Knocked. This was a crazy, and in the fullness of time, this wasn't that big a deal actually, but the Crystal Knocked story was that it was almost nothing. Like buses that people use in Silicon Valley to go to work, one of them got stopped.
Yes.
By protesters.
Yes.
So literally nothing happened.
But it made the news. It was a big news deal,
it made
right?
The news.
Yeah.
A billionaire who wasn't even on the bus, like literally the least impacted guy who, if you were impacted, it was a 15-minute bus delay, made the decision to compare himself to the Jews in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and this is a guy who doesn't even live in the city where the bus was stopped, right? Just, for the record.
And so at one point, I guess I was fairly outraged in that podcast and talked a little bit about it. I think I spoke briefly about what the Crystal Knocked was, but in retrospect, it was just kind of a crazy thing more than it was an important thing, I guess.
Well, I thought there were some really interesting points that came out of that conversation. One is that having a lot of money does not guarantee your brains. Yeah. I think we've all learned that, right? It doesn't guarantee that you've got a filter between what you think and what you say.
Clearly, you think people care, but
yeah. But there was one point that was made around Google buses, and I thought this was very interesting. Somebody in that conversation said, "Wow, Google is they're a great company. They had all these people commuting, and they really wanted to do the right thing for the environment, so they went and they got these buses."
Yeah.
Well, let's stop and think about that for a minute, because I have a little different version of that. I think Google stepped back and said, wow, we've got all these people commuting that we're paying a lot of money to, and all these people are spending an hour to an hour and a half in their car each way.
Yeah.
And if I get them a bus with Wi-Fi, I'm going to get 3 productive hours back out of those people every day.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think there might be some environment there, but I think it might be, I'm going to capture an extra 3 hours a day out of my employees. And, oh, by the way, this is a great recruiting tool.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And the funny thing, the weird thing is the buses are just so, they're such an easy emblem, right? They're these big things. They cruise through the city. Of course, you don't see it when it's like 50 cars. Instead, you're like, oh, this is just crappy traffic, basically. But it's, the people on the bus are people. Like, they're whatever people they're supposedly displacing are just different people. Like, they're all, everyone's just trying to make a living.
Yeah, I mean,
they're not flying their jets to work.
Listen, exactly. Everybody's trying to get to their job. I think what comes out of this in future podcasts, this was brought up a few different times in different ways, is I think there's a general sentiment for people who've lived in the city. And in particular, the Mission area of the city is been around for a very long time in a very certain way, with a very certain demographic, and that's all being displaced now. Yep. And there's people who've lived here for a very long time, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or second generation, and they're being displaced out of rentals. Yeah. And I think they're equating it to people coming in and raping their city. I really do believe that. I think in their mind we've got people who are coming in who aren't working in the city. They're taking advantage of the situation. They're willing to live an extended sort of college lifestyle and pay obscene amounts of money, and the landlords are greedy, and so they're going to take that money, and my friends are being displaced, and everybody's having to move over to Oakland or wherever. And somehow that falls on the individual who is the techie as opposed to the landlord who is allowing it to happen. So.
Yeah, it's a story, something I saw recently that's happened since then is there's a coffee shop in my neighborhood that went out, and it's too bad that it went out. It was a lovely coffee shop. Unfortunately, it was lovely because there was never anyone in there, and you could have a good conversation, but not great for business. And so the rent got jacked on them, and so somebody posted a rant on the door about this. And they typed up this thing about how they were pissed. Whoever got the displaced, and I went over and read it. I was going for a walk, and it basically, the old lady who owns this place is 77-year-old, whoever it is, and she's greedy. So the landlord is an elderly lady. This is the evil person. And as of this date, the rent got jacked from $3,500 a month to $5,000 a month. Now, I understand it's a big increase in rent, but it's a older woman raising the rent from $3,500 to $5,000. It's
what the market will bear, by the way.
And it's not $1 billion. It's a lot of money, but I don't know.
It's a lot of money. It's what the market will bear. There's good restaurants going out because the landlords are want to increase the rent. They think that they can. And oh, by the way, there's this thing called supply and demand.
Yeah.
And free market economy, it does work.
Yeah.
And we will find out where that intersection is.
Yeah.
And some people aren't going to rent their space for a very long time because they're going to ask too much. Yeah. And then rents are going to come down.
But it goes the other way too. All these buildings are going up. How many? 3,000. So in San Francisco, there's a building on every corner going up, and each one must have 40, 50, 100 units. There's a lot of people make money in this town, but that many people pay $5,000 rent for a place?
It is unbelievable. I was coming back across the Bay Bridge about 2 weeks ago, and I think I counted a dozen cranes.
Yeah.
I mean, all big
It's like
buildings.
being in Shanghai right now.
Yeah, it's insane. For those of you who haven't been out here, try to check it out on Google. I'm sure there's aerial photos, but it is amazing to see how much development and high buildings, big buildings, tall, going up. I was at an intersection last night, and I thought, wow, I'm almost starting to feel like I'm in Manhattan, where like the streets are now just very dark, and there's very little light, and these were all new construction going up.
It's crazy, and we'll get to it. The 24th podcast, somebody from who really knew housing well, who worked at a HUD housing project when he was like 23, and would find dead bodies in the morning kind of thing.
Oh,
it had some really thoughtful things to say on that. But moving down the road, episode 3, we talked to Eric Hall. He's the guy who helped me set this up. He works at Dolby, the sound guys. I never did figure out what they do that they get to be at the beginning of every movie. He talked about working in a corporate job in Silicon Valley.
Yes, he did.
Not everybody is in a 3 to 5 person startup. There's a lot of people working for fine corporations here in Silicon Valley, and he talked about how he found that rewarding.
Yes, there are a lot of corporations here. There are a lot of people that have those jobs, and they make a very nice living, and they work a very normal career and normal hours, and they don't get caught up in the madness. I thought that was very interesting. One thing that I did think was interesting that came out of that is you had a little conversation around Monster Cable.
Yeah.
And as you may or may not know, I was spent several years in working with a company, with Fortune 500 company. It had an engineered solutions component. But I remember when Monster Cable was just coming out, we were actually looking at near neighbor opportunities. We were thinking about getting into audio because we had an audio cable. Monster Cable has made an incredible living and an incredible margin off of doing nothing but widening the pipe.
Right.
Just for those of you out there who don't know, all that happened is there's no oxygen-free wire cable doesn't really exist. It's a great marketing tool, but if you really look at what they did, all they did is they took your 18 and 22 gauge speaker wire and made it into 12 gauge speaker wire. That's it.
Holy crap, that's technical.
That's it. That's it. And they got a lot of money for it, and they've continued to get a lot of money for it. And they created a great brand.
Yeah.
So
Eric Hall. The next one, this is where I kind of learned. We talked to Michael White, and I'll mention this. So this was not the most interesting one because we talked about maintaining control of your board. I'm not sure that's a great path to go down on these podcasts. And we've had much more entertaining ones with Michael White, too, so I only say that in the spirit of
well, I
that
thought,
one.
you know, I think it's interesting because it's a good conversation to have. And Michael's certainly a great guy to talk about, you know, how do you get control of your board and maintain control of your board. What I did think was interesting is that, you know, Michael said, hey, I've got a Juris Doctorate, but nobody calls us doctors, they call us lawyers. And I stepped back, and as I was listening to that, I laughed a little bit, and I said, yeah, that's because doctors heal people.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But, you know, Michael's a great guy. We've both known him for some time, and he's very, you know, he's a great source of information. You know, if you're in startup land and you're looking for some good advice, he's a good guy.
Yeah. And we moved on. He'd do 2 in a row. We talked to Michael about sexism, 2 guys talking about sexism, what could go wrong. Fortunately, nothing did go wrong. He's raising 2 daughters, fairly thoughtful on the topic. And that was the first of several sexism things we talked about on the podcast.
You know, and that's true. And you and I touched on it a little bit as well when we talked about globalization. But something occurred to me as I was going back and revisiting all of these, and we talked about sexism. You know, 2 things occurred to me. One is it's been here, it's still here, and it's going to be here for a while. I don't see it going away, and it's unfortunate. And at some point, I think you guys talked about brogrammers off one of the TV series, but there is the bro code of sort of business out here, and you do get that, and you do see it. And I've certainly been in startups where women have come to work and been incredibly uncomfortable, even just in the environment. So it does exist, and there's very little effort, I think, made to make women feel comfortable, which is sad, and it saddens me to say that. However, the second thing that occurred to me is there is a bit of it happening in reverse now. There are companies and incubators that are women-founded, women-sourced, and they are staying very close to the vest and seeking out other females that, you know, are just going to help them and be sources for them for knowledge. And insofar even as there are other companies, and some of them have created businesses a la an Avon type model where, you know, you're out there selling to other moms and you know, door-to-door sort of equivalent of door-to-door sales. And it's all women.
Yeah.
There's not a man in sight. Yeah. So while we talk about it, and again, it saddens me, it is interesting if you listen to that and think about it a little bit in reverse when you're listening to that.
Yeah.
Some of it does exist today.
Yeah, that's right. And that's not, I don't think that's the ideal either, having like an all, I mean, that's just not going to work. Like,
it's not.
You don't want an all-male company, you don't want an all-female company. So the sexism thing became a theme. I think that's probably the part I learned the most about in this podcast, where my view of the world changed the most from what I thought. And we'll talk about that in some of the sexism ones coming up.
Yeah.
I think we moved on to Nick Heyman, who was the 5th employee at Goldman Sachs. This one's
at Facebook. He was the 8th or 9th. He was the 8th or 9th. He wasn't sure on counting employee at Facebook. Yes. Yeah.
And that was a great conversation. I recommend people go back and listen to that one. He just had some thoughtful things to say, having been at Facebook. He seemed to just get it. And
I think it's a great one to listen to. If you haven't listened to it, please do. And my takeaway from that is I thought and listened to him and thought about what he was thinking when he went to work there. And you think about that's early days, employee number 8 or 9.
Yeah.
Who's employee number 8 or 9 today at the business that is going to be the next Facebook?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's out there somewhere.
Yep.
And so it just sort of dawned on me as I was listening to it. I was thinking, who today has that number 8 or number 9 job in the next version of what Facebook's going to be? And there is going to be a next version.
Well, and it wasn't at the time. It wasn't obvious that Facebook was going to be what it was going to be. You know, they
you knew it was going to be big. You knew it was going to be big.
Yeah, but when you went to their office, you know, it's like they were showing up at 1 or 2. There were the beer cans everywhere, and in retrospect, obviously they were working quite hard. But I know a few people went there and said, "Yeah, this isn't for me." I mean, in retrospect, boy, did they? Was that the wrong opportunity to pass up? To pass up. He also talks a little bit in that about what it's like to realize that you're wealthy. Like when you weren't wealthy the day before, now you're in your 30s and you're incredibly wealthy. So
I mean, very interesting, and I think his perspective is very interesting also, especially for the entrepreneurs.
Yep. Then Michael White and I think we moved on and mocked the show Silicon Valley.
Yes, this is you did mock the show Silicon Valley, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier. The one thing that came to my mind out of this entire podcast was, people, please stop making movies in San Francisco. Leave our town alone and let us continue to drive in our own streets. I came home last night, and yet again another movie is being filmed on my street. every other week they're closing down the street for a movie. Last night, I was going down to Hotel Vital to meet a friend of mine who's in from Bellingham, Washington. I hadn't seen in a while. And there's limited 3 to 7 parking in that area to begin with.
Right.
You're lucky if you can get into a garage because I was meeting him around 4:15. Garages are generally full. And the little bit of parking that was left was, guess what? All blocked by movie vehicles and movie vans and stage guys and everything else. And I just don't know what happened. Apparently, you can't make a movie anywhere else other than San Francisco right now.
We've become we're the new Toronto.
I guess so. So, but yeah, it's interesting, and I think that's actually where you mentioned the bro grammars or whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then we talked to African American CEO. Is that on track?
No, the next one was Eric Hall. No, there was number 8 with Eric Hall.
That was the one that was the corporate culture.
And I thought that was really funny because you said to Eric, "Hey, you're back," and he's like, "Yeah, I think I'm the first guy to be able to say I'm back."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh no, Eric, I didn't want to tell you this, but Michael's been there 3 times."
Exactly. And so he came back. Corporate culture. We mentioned that, and then he interviewed me. That was one of the episodes.
He did you in number 10, right?
Yeah.
Which is where you were going to get syndicated and make billions of dollars. Right?
That didn't happen. I was a little disappointed.
Well, you got a trip to Mexico City out of it, though, so you can't be that bummed, right? That worked out.
Things are looking up.
Yeah, I mean, I thought what was interesting is somewhere around in there, one of the conversations or one of the points that was made is what's going to happen. And I think you might have been talking about New York and how they've continued to pick on San Francisco because they've got nothing else to do.
Oh, that kept coming up in the podcast because as we talked, there'd be an article about New York every freaking day.
Oh, yeah.
In the paper, and they just seem to be obsessed with San Francisco.
Yeah, and I've got a note on that we'll talk about in a second. But what I did want to bring up was that I thought it was really interesting. Somewhere along the lines, it was what's going to happen if when the bubble bursts, or if the bubble burst was a part of an article. And that was however many months ago or what have you. And let's just think about the recent warnings that we've heard, which you and I talked about in one of our podcasts, and we've since seen Mark Andreessen come out, and it's continued, which... you've got maybe a read on this, but my read is the environment might be starting to shift a little bit. Yep. People might be starting to hold the money a little closer to their vest. I think bets are going to start coming off the table.
Yep.
It's about time. Funds need to be raised again.
Yeah.
And we might be starting to get towards, if you look cyclically, it's about right. We might be starting to get towards the end here.
I mean, on the one hand, the difference this time, because always different, but some of these companies are generating enormous amounts of cash flow, Facebook and Twitter, so they're not just pipe dream companies. On the other hand, in the labor market, they're not employing that many people. Like Facebook, maybe they're at 3,000 people now, but they're not at 80,000 people like other multi-billion-dollar airlines.
Yeah, you're not making up for manufacturing facilities, right? I mean, the good old days of when we were building a lot here in the United States, you're not employing those numbers of people, certainly around the clock, what have you, when it was really popular. That's all gone.
Yeah, exactly. So then the African American one.
That's right. That was Vince. Vince, good. I mean, great guy.
That was fantastic. The interesting takeaway from that, we were talking about why he went to Stanford.
Yep.
And African American friend, super successful, but at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and that kind of thing. And I was like, why aren't there as many CEOs in Silicon Valley? Your friends aren't not successful; they're just not doing Silicon Valley. And what he kind of came around to is like, look, if you're an African American guy who made your way to Stanford, you've been through some crap in your life. It's been rough. You've been disadvantaged, et cetera, et cetera. And when Goldman Sachs comes along and offers you like $500,000 a year, you take it. You're like, yeah, that's a pretty good job. I'm going to do that. I don't. And he contrasted it maybe unfairly to people like Mark Zuckerberg who grew up, life is great, everything's going to be great. I can take some risks.
Right.
So he kind of said they've already taken their risk and they'll work for Goldman Sachs for $500,000 a year. Thank you very much.
Well, sure. I mean, you and I both know plenty of guys and girls who've been through that, and they've worked plenty hard, and they've gotten their opportunity, and they've worked hard to get where they are. They've worked twice as hard as you or I did.
Right.
I mean, let's just call it what it is, because they had to do all the schoolwork and everything else, but then they had to do everything just way better.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they got their shot, and they should take it. And Vince is a great guy. I mean, fantastic. Now, my takeaway from that was probably a little different than yours, and no offense, Vince, but somebody brought up Herb Cain in that interview. Yes, and I think it was you, and you were talking about times were great, and we're nostalgic for old San Francisco, and I love it. I loved it, and I loved reading Herb Cain as did I.
Yeah.
And I uncovered an interesting fact, and everybody should take advantage of this. On Hurricane Day in San Francisco, you can find 25-cent martinis.
Oh, really?
Yes, if you walk into a bar and say, it is Hurricane Day, I'd like a martini,
All right.
there are 25-cent martinis all over this city. I did not know that.
Everyone just earned their entrance fee for listening to this podcast.
That's it. That's it. So
that's great.
A very good friend of mine told me that today. And as I was talking to her about...
What day is Hurricane Day now?
I don't know. We got to find that out. We've got to find that out. But here's the other thing that then suddenly came into my head for no apparent reason is 25-cent martini. And then I was writing it down. What is a 25-cent martini? And I used the cent sign.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me, when was the last time you saw a cent sign?
Yeah, right.
It doesn't exist anymore.
That's true.
Right? When you and I were growing up, you saw cent signs on like chalkboards and that. But I haven't seen a cent sign, and I can't remember how long.
I want a 25-cent martini at some point, though.
Well, we got to find out Hurricane Day.
That sounds good. Hey, what do you get? What was it? When we moved on to
well, then you did me, which was Eric interviewing you, and then you went on and had I think a really interesting conversation with Michael about. So I think it was a little bit about how careers have changed in Silicon Valley. And the I think sort of my takeaway on that was. Again, for those of you who haven't listened to it, I really urge you to listen to it because there's a lot of interesting information about what does a career look like today in Silicon Valley, not necessarily everywhere, because we were just talking about Vince, who's did the corporate gig for a very long time, and I've talked about others. Eric Hall again, did the corporate gig, but I do think Silicon Valley has created this new sort of strange job function, which is you're really like a W-2 freelancer.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Right? I mean, you go to work for a company for a year or 2 years. It works or it doesn't work. You're W-2'd, and you sort of go on to the next one if you don't think it's done it, or you took your, you got through your first year cliff and you took what you could off the table and you said, I'm going to go on to the next one, and you did that. I think they've created this new W-2 freelancer environment, and you and I've talked about, just think if you went to work for 6 companies or 5 companies for 2 years each, it's 10 years, but you've got 5 bets on the table.
Yeah. And that's what Nick Heyman advises, like a 20-something engineer, that he or she should do that. Like try to make smarter bets too. Like
make smart, right.
Your buddy's firm that has no traction is going nowhere. Like Mark, if you join Mark Zuckerberg as the earliest, riskiest, you shouldn't be doing this employee in his dorm room, he still had a product that was dominating one after another college campus within 2 days of being launched there. If Mark Zuckerberg wasn't sitting with a whiteboard going, hey, I've got an idea.
Right.
So
that's correct.
Make some smart bets and make a lot of them, and you could end up wealthy.
Well, I think that's right. And I think what's also interesting is, and you should think about this, again, here we go with career advice, right? Somehow we morphed into that last time, but you should think about this when you're coming out to Silicon Valley. That only happens here, folks. And in sort of the technology areas, but don't come here and go to work for 5 companies at 2 years each and then think you're going to go to work for Procter & Gamble or Johnson & Johnson, because they're going to look at that and go, wow, what was the problem?
Yeah, why can't you hold a job?
Yeah, exactly. So just be aware of that.
Yeah. Yep. So somewhere in here we go to Hollywood. Are we in Hollywood yet?
Well, I think we're close to Hollywood. There was the Grateful Dead. Yes.
Right.
So don't forget Linda.
Linda Kelly. The lot of I think talking about the history of the Bay Area is good. I just think that's interesting. I don't know.
I think it's fantastic. And Linda has a lot of history, and she's done the bi-coastal thing. Did New York, been back. She I think her perspective is interesting. If you want to hear some good stories, she's a good one to tell some good stories. So I think that was a great one. And personally, I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah.
I'd really love to see you get some people in from other parts of the culture here. Get somebody who's an old time, maybe Seals fan, right? San Francisco Seals, or what was it like, back when the Niners were playing a Kezar, right? I mean, be really interesting.
Well, and with respect to the Grateful Dead, I think they were Steve Jobs' favorite band, and everyone always says that the merger of sort of LSD culture and technology is what why Apple has beautiful products that you can interact with as a human being, but also the great technology behind them. Whether it's true or not,
It makes sense. I mean, it does make sense if you think about it. Certainly, Steve Jobs did an amazing job, and the Grateful Dead did an amazing job, and we both know people who still love the Dead and follow them. And I'm lucky enough. I was telling you, I certainly won't name names, but I'm lucky enough to race a sailboat with the gentleman who worked with them for a very long time at a very senior level, and used to have Jerry over at his house all the time. And he's got amazingly good stories. We hear a lot of good stories and a lot of fun, but there's a whole culture there. And so I think that was a good one. Yep.
So somewhere in here we get to Hollywood. Are we in Hollywood yet? Are we? Well, then I talked to Rachel Fairbanks about the first time we talked. I don't remember. Oh, we made fun of hipsters for a whole episode. I won't lie to you. It felt good. Yeah. It was ridiculous. I had people tell me that, man, you guys, you got some issues. It was a mean-spirited podcast. And it just felt good. I won't lie to you.
Yeah, so you know what?
It was easy. It was fun.
And you know what? It should feel good.
And no hipsters were harmed in the making of the podcast. I think I mentioned that.
Yeah, it should feel good. And it's interesting because you go back to, if you look at a lot of the podcasts, you listen to them, listen to some of the strains, there's a common strain that's gone through some of them, which is, you do have these young hipsters with sort of a lack of sense of taste, and when you talk to Eric, he's like a couple of mediocre earbuds in their ear, watching a movie on a smartphone. That's their source of entertainment, and content now trumps quality, and you've got the crazy hipster mentality, and it is true. They're not going to be here to culturally enhance this town.
No, that's true.
I mean, come on, right? They're here. They're living the party. They're drinking the cocktails, and in 3 years when they want to grow up or they meet somebody and they decide they want to settle down and get married, they're going to get whipped into shape, and time to go back to Wyoming or Montana or wherever you're going to go, where you were from, and go work on the farm. Right. So, thanks for coming in. Happy you're leaving.
Yeah. That was a fun episode, but mean-spirited. But,
it
felt good.
I have a funny feeling that there are a lot of people listening to that, smiling and laughing in their cars.
Well, saying, you forgot to mention the other thing. Man, that was good. All right, that's enough of that for one day. Thank you for listening. We'll be next. We'll be next. We'll be back. We'll be back next week with part 2 of the Something Venture Podcast 25th Epi-versary. Thanks for listening.